Today we're going to talk about podcasting and what your churches can be using podcasting for. Are you ready? Because it's time.
You're listening to the Church Digital Sidekick Podcast, part of the TCD Podcast Network.
Hey, my name is Tom Pounder. I'm the host, and this is the Church Digital Sidekick Podcast. Podcasting is really a big deal. I mean, obviously, you're listening to a podcast right now, assuming you're listening to the audio version, not the video version of it. But podcasting is really a big deal right now, and lots of people are using it to share content and share information, and lots of churches are using it. So what can your church or your ministry use podcasting for? I invited my friend Joe Radosovich to the podcast. He's been on the podcast before, and he's just someone great to talk about. And he actually is doing a new podcast that is targeted towards his local community. And so today we're going to talk about what his podcast is, and then we're going to branch it out and talk a little bit more about what your church or your ministry can use podcasting for, because there's lots of great opportunities for it. What can you use it for, and how can you use it? That's what we're going to talk about in today's podcast. Are you ready? All right. Let's get into it with Joe Radosovich talking podcasting right now. All right, with me right now is my friend Joe Radosovich. Joe, how are you, man?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you. Well, we can see each other. This is actually, we're going to show the video on YouTube, but we'll also do the audio here on the podcast form. And so, that's a step up now. Now that I'm doing the Church Digital Sidekick Podcast, there's actually I'm doing video now too. So this is like double buckle now. I have to do my hair and everything like that.
I didn't know this. I would have set up the background. So you see, I just switched the camera because I did not realize we were doing that. So.
Let's start again. You want to start again?
Yeah. I've got a shelf up there with stuff inspired by Jeff Reed.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. You ready to begin?
Yeah, man.
Yeah. All right. With me right now is my friend Joe Radosovich. Joe, how are you, man?
I'm good. It's good to talk with you. Good to see you. For those that are on YouTube.
Yeah, man, it's good to see you too. Yeah, that's the thing. Now that I'm the Church Digital Sidekick, I don't just do the audio stuff. People can actually watch us on video. I mean, if they want to see my ugly face and everything like that, they can see us on video. So, that's cool, man. Well, I'm glad you're with me today. How
awesome.
Have things been going?
Good. We've been in a season of transition. We moved states and homes and been settling into a new ministry here in Illinois. So, I feel like we're kind of settling in just a bit.
Nothing like COVID to just start all over again, right? And everything but you had moved a little bit before COVID, right? Or did you move during COVID?
It kind of started last spring. It was kind of a weird transition. I should say last winter. We sold our house last January, and I started my new ministry here in mid-June. So we kind of bounced around a little bit, staying with family. So it was kind of a longer move than I had hoped for.
Yeah. Well, how do you like Illinois?
Oh, we love it. Like right now, the leaves are changing and the weather's cool and it's glorious. Illinois, Midwest falls are really, really nice.
My parents lived out in Illinois for a few years, and I went out to visit them one Thanksgiving time, and I just remember it being really, really awesome. And I also remember they don't have this on the East Coast, but they have those what is it, Jack in the Box restaurants or something like that. I don't know.
I know those from Texas. I have not seen those around here.
Oh, really? Okay, cool. Well, that was always, anywhere you go across the country, you always run into different shops that are like centralized in that particular area. So that's the one thing I remembered about Illinois, the Jack in the Box. But cool. Hey, well, let's get going on this, because we want to talk about podcasting, but leading into that a little bit, I want to talk about what you're doing with podcasting, because you've been doing some cool things with podcasting lately. So I want you to tell me a little bit about your podcast, the one that you're doing about sermons, and how that is helping other ministries.
Yeah, so I sat on this idea for a little while, just kind of waiting until the situation was right. And so I had this idea in my mind, but I was like, the co-host really needs to be the right person and the right fit. And so when I moved down here, I became friends with a local pastor, and I'm in a very rural situation, for us, within 15 miles, there's 42,000 people, but we're surrounded by cornfields. So if you include all the towns within 15 miles, then it adds up. But that's still not much compared to a city, probably like where you're located. You're like, there's like 42,000 people within 5 miles,
Yeah.
or 3 miles. But so there's a number of people in the area, and this is a pastor of a church about 18 miles away. And so we started a joint podcast where we take 30 minutes and we're doing an 8-week season where we discuss what we preached that week. So just a really short version of our sermon, and then just a discussion, kind of just what we would talk about if we were in a coffee shop or if we're riding in the truck together to a meeting or something. And so I'm big on the philosophy of document, don't create. And I was like, we have several goals with the podcast, but it's to give people a behind the scenes look at our sermons, because it's work we've already done. It just takes us 30 minutes to sit down and record a conversation around it. And more people listen to that than listen to the Sunday sermon podcast, because it's two sermons, from two different churches, but it's from two friends. We're not trying to teach anybody something. We're just saying, hey, this is what's going on. So
That's awesome. And so so you share each other's the sermon stuff, and then do you break down like the process you went through to come up with the sermon, or what do you do with that?
sometimes we do. The biggest thing is like 5 minutes or less for our sermons. We're not like redoing our entire
Right.
sermon, but like, hey, and so we usually like dive straight into, this is what was going on in the text. And this is the point that I was preaching from this. And so then we might ask back and forth questions about, well, how did you do it? What did you do with this? Or how did you apply that? Or maybe how did you introduce that? But we do that. And then I usually come to the conversation with a question. Like the podcast we recorded last night, I was asking, what is one of your quirks when you prepare a sermon? And like, who are your preaching influences? Specifically, a preaching influence and a non-preaching influence. And so Jeremy, the co-host, he was sharing about how Steve Jobs has influenced how he dresses when he preaches. That's nothing that would ever fit in a sermon. But if you're wanting a behind the scenes look at the sermon, then that's a great fit for that. So sometimes we dive into how did you develop the sermon, but it's usually some aspect of something that's going on with that. And so my big goals that I had shared with Jeremy, and he goes, I love it, let's do it, was I want people who live in our local area to feel comfortable with the pastors in one of these two churches. Because I'm big on creating a church that's comprehensible to outsiders, and that makes them feel welcome and like, okay, I could see myself going there. And a lot of the time you go to a church website and it's just all formal, and it's just like there's a stage, and this is a conversation between two guys as if they were riding in a truck together, where I'm cheering Jeremy on and learning from him, and he's cheering me on and learning from me. And so it's like, hey, these guys aren't competing like you would think two churches would do. Instead, they're cheering each other on at what they're good at. And so one is to help make our church comprehensible to people in our community. And one of my big goals is to have 4 times as many visitors in a year as we average on a given Sunday. Unseminary says the goal should be 2 times that, but my goal is 4 times that. Because I've forgotten the guy, you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So he said your goal should be to have 2 times the number of average in the week visit in a given year. And I'm like, no, let's shoot for 4, because I really want lost people to hear the gospel. So in our context, we're really focused locally. We're not really trying to make a global or national podcast. But if you live in central Illinois, especially west central Illinois, I want you to know and feel comfortable in one of these 2 churches. I actually hope to bring in other pastors from other churches as well to give them the chance to speak into that. Another goal is obviously to help the people in our church. And then ultimately, when you're in a rural situation, raising up leaders is really hard. And it's really hard to convince somebody to leave somewhere or to leave seminary and go to a rural place, where the idea of leading a church of 2,000 people is unheard of, because you would be, my county has 5,000.
Right.
Like This isn't it. They're the kinds of stores that are available are just harder to recruit people to come to. And so part of our goal is to go, hey, can our conversation help raise up other leaders who can like devote themselves to like loving Jesus and loving the church and growing the church without like having to go to seminary? So going, hey, can we serve the churches around us and the young leaders who might be considering ministry? So those are kind of our three goals. We're largely focused locally, but we know those local people are online. So reaching them digitally is the way to do that.
Well, and again, I think this is important again, because I think when people think online, like I'm going to go online, I'm going to do a YouTube channel, or I'm going to do a podcast, that I'm going to hit all the world, and I want to reach everybody all across the world. And listen, that's great if you want to do that, but I love how you're using it as strategic for local, and you're using this as a resource, and you're using Medium for a local community. And you're like, hey, listen, we're looking for our local audience. We're not looking to try to reach the whole world. And so I think that's really cool that you have that focus and direction there. And I like it, again, like how you were saying, it kind of is like you're trying to reach new people. You're trying to add a benefit to the people who are already coming to your church. And then you're also trying to raise up leaders. And so do you guys talk about, like in your podcast, do you guys talk about action steps like that you wanted people to take from your sermon that you were doing just now?
Yeah, that's usually embedded in the part where we talk about our sermon, where where we're explaining that, because Jeremy and I have similar like visions for preaching, but they're different. And so he can talk about the four people he's targeting in a sermon. And so he might say, hey, this is how I was doing so and so. I believe that a sermon is taking God's word and explaining what's here and then applying it to the hearers that are in the room. And so everything that I do is framed in terms of I'm applying this to the people here. And so our podcast just naturally is like, this is this is what like the action step from the sermon was. And in 10 minutes, you get two of those. Yeah. So
that's really cool. I really like that format. And you say you keep it to about 30 minutes long?
Yeah, like today I had to cut a ton of time off the beginning and the end to get it to 37 minutes, because he and I are friends, and I hope that comes through in the podcast, that like I'm genuinely learning from him and enjoy having a discussion. And like we're both talking about something that we love, like so sometimes you listen to a podcast where someone is creating a podcast because they want some kind of an outcome. And I'm really, really big on the philosophy of document with social media and especially podcasting. Document what you're doing. Don't create something. And so then with Jeremy and with other people, I've explained, one time I went down a rabbit hole of just watching YouTube videos of people doing something that they're good at. And so seeing one of the greatest mixing audio, music mixing engineers go through the aspects of mixing, compressing, equalizing Carrie Underwood's voice, or an electric guitar solo in a metal band, and he's spending 30 minutes showing you what dials he turns and and I'm like, I don't ever do this, but seeing somebody do something that they love and that they're good at is really cool. And so I went, what if we just had I would love to hear a preacher I admire have a conversation about what I was preparing this week, what I got excited about, what I'm struggling with, what I, right now, what I'm working on in my sermon, because every preacher I know is working on something, whether it's hand motions or cadence or, some aspect of that. So I like that behind the scenes look, and this is intended to be a behind the scenes look for people.
I love what you just said there. You're documenting this through the podcast and stuff and the social media stuff. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and someone might be thinking, "Where's Tom going with this?" But trust me, we are going somewhere with this, because we are talking about podcasting today. So give me a little bit of background. Do you have on just you as a technical person? Did you have training in this stuff? Like in recording and all this stuff? Obviously you learn stuff, but is your background training in podcasting or audio or video stuff?
No, well, when I was in high school, I kind of had a part-time job. I ran sound for the church, which I was bad at because I didn't have a long enough attention span. And so I'd like miss my cues. Mics would be muted and they needed to be turned on. But I knew how to set up audio equipment
Yep.
from doing weddings, funerals, your church stuff, events,
Mhm.
concerts. So I knew it from there. And then serving in a small church, it was just kind of like I knew that the way into the church was going to be online. And so I learned to mix the sermon and do things like noise reduction, compressing, mixing, some of just the basic sermon stuff.
Yep.
And 2 or 3 years ago, I was like, I really want to understand podcasting beyond just posting a sermon.
Mhm.
And so that was when my wife and I started our podcast that we've done 3 seasons, I really 2 seasons and a mini season, where we'll just document something that we're doing. So it was actually during COVID, we actually just spent a year every week documenting our garden. It's like, hey, what's new in our garden this week?
Mhm.
And so by the end of the year, we had kind of documented our first year of COVID and our garden every week.
That's
And so
cool.
it gave me the chance to figure out, what do we need? What do we not need? What's a good service to use?
Yep.
Do you need a mic? And if you don't have a mic, what do you do? So, so that's
Cool.
kind of my,
Yep. Good. No, this is perfect. This is perfect. This is going good. Okay, so do you need a mic or do you not need a mic? What do you need for equipment? I have a mic, but again, for the longest time, I just used a headphone with a mic thing on it. So if you're going to be doing a podcast, what kind of a mic do you need?
you don't. You can just use your phone, especially if you use Anchor. Spotify owns it now, but Anchor is a really, really good service
Yep.
that helps get it to the places that you need, and it's pretty painless. You can just use your phone. Try and do it in a place that doesn't have a lot of bouncing. But like, if your goal is not to be the next NPR podcast or the next Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, if your goal is to like get 30 to 50 people or 100 people to listen, then they actually just care to hear from you, not, they don't care what your equipment is.
Yep.
So there's that. With our podcast, I do record a Zoom call and then I take it quickly into Audacity and do something called noise reduction and compression. But that's like, it takes less than 5 minutes to do it. And it means that Jeremy can just use whatever his headphones are. I can use my headphones, or I can even use the webcam microphone.
Mhm.
And the audio, especially once you've done a noise reduction, which basically just takes all the extra noise out of it, then you have a listenable podcast that, if your goal is modest, like let's get 100 to 300 people listening to this, then they don't care, did you have a mic or not?
Yep. Listen, I think that's a really important thing in what you just said here. Again, we already talked about it for a quick second, but again, your podcast doesn't have to reach the whole world. You don't have to be the next Joe Rogan or big person doing podcasts. You don't have to make hundreds of millions of dollars doing this. You can simply just do it to reach a specific audience. And again, we're going to get into this when we talk about churches and what churches can be doing. But that's really important. Again, for the longest time, I didn't have a mic. I bought a mic, and my mic was probably about $40 that I got off of Amazon. It's a quality one, but it's not the most expensive one. And so you don't need to do that. And then you can get a service like Anchor. And I would strongly recommend that. I actually just switched my podcast over to Anchor as my host, and you don't pay anything. It's completely free, and it's really easy to put together. What do you put your podcast actually together in Anchor, or do you use another program?
I do now. I do now. I have done it in Adobe before.
Yeah.
I put a previous, it was actually a sermon podcast where we would take the audio from our sermon bumper and put an intro and finish. But you can do that in Anchor. You don't have, like, Anchor is good enough.
Yep.
And Anchor is just super easy.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you hit on Audacity. Wait, is it that's what it's called, right?
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about because I've used it before, but I never knew how to say it actually. Is that a free program?
Yeah, it's a free program, and it's pretty professional level
Yeah.
program, but it's a free program. You can watch a couple tutorials and learn how to do it. It's not really that hard. But again, you don't have to do that. I just know how, and I was like, I'm just wanting some of the echo in the rooms from our recording to be out of it. So let me just take literally less than 5 minutes and do that in there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and see what I do on my podcast is I actually take this video, I take the audio from the video and use GarageBand for the audio part of this. And I'm very familiar with GarageBand, but if you're not, it doesn't take long for you to figure out GarageBand and how to use it. I mean, I didn't know it before I started, but now I've been doing podcasting for a number of years, so I'm very comfortable with it. But you could even take it and film a whole bunch of video segments, put it in iMovie, take the video from it, or you can take the audio from it and it works just the same. So there's lots of really simple things to do. And again, I'm highlighting this because I want people to understand that it's not rocket science to do a podcast. You don't need all this training. You don't need all this background. Joe and I did not go to school to learn how to do podcasting. And we're ministers at heart. And so we've just learned to pick up this stuff. And Joe is very technically sound. We've talked about a number of different things that Joe does, and that is awesome. You can actually check out our old podcast. We've done a number of podcasts that I've been blown away by Joe and his tech savviness. And so he's not just a really good farmer, he's actually a really good tech guy too. So okay, so let's get into this. Okay, so I love how you're doing this podcast, and you're doing it for your local community, and you're giving them behind the scenes look at things. What are some other things that churches can do? Because we all know the number one thing that churches do for podcasts. Their podcasts, likely if they're podcasting at all, churches are using their sermon, correct?
Yeah, and you should do that, and you should make it super easy because visitors will want to hear a recent sermon.
Yep.
And so I picked up some stuff from Brady Shearer, some stuff from Carrie Newhoff, but a lot of churches don't do a podcast, or they don't do it very well, and then they don't just basically display it in an easy way that makes people want to binge their sermons.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time you look and you go, I have no idea what that title means, and I don't care to ever listen to that.
Yes. Let's hit on this for a quick second. I think we get too creative with our titles. And
Yeah.
And people are like, what is this title? I don't even know what it is.
So Brady Shearer talks about this, and our church does this, and I am incredibly proud of it. We have a secretary who's in her 70s who edits our audio, because I taught her how to use Audacity. She does a great job.
She's in her 70s, and you
oh yeah
this? Yes.
Yeah, she's awesome. She can use DaVinci Resolve, and
really, that's nice.
She can use DaVinci Resolve and Audacity and sync up stuff. She can do stuff that I can't do now, and that's taken place in the last 4 months because she's just like, hey, I like a challenge, I want to learn something.
Yeah.
So she's gone far beyond me on some of those things, but by displaying in the podcast the series name first, then putting in a colon, and then putting in the sermon name, the most important part is the sermon type, or I'm sorry, the sermon series, okay, not the sermon name. And then Brady Shearer talks about using some question as that title. It doesn't even matter what it is so much as, hey, this is the series. Here is a question that this sermon answers. And then the description of the podcast, you should do it on YouTube videos as well, means that somebody can look and go, oh, here's the text, here's the preacher, here's the topic, here's the series name, and here's the church website. And when you do that, then people will actually binge series, because it's like right now we're going through Exodus 1 through 20, and it's called I Will Fight for You. I don't even care what the title is. I write one every week, but if we lose that piece of paper, we can just make one up, because the series name is so important, because then people can go, oh, I want to listen to this whole series. Well, it's the Netflix effect. So Brady Shearer is the one who introduced me to that, and it's incredibly effective. And people they'll listen to the whole series, not just which one has a catchy title.
Yeah, and again, the catchy title is only catchy for us as ministers. Again, a lot of people don't even know what they're doing. I will say this: we do a lot of YouTube videos, and I think our creative team gets a little bit too creative with their titles of what they call it. I actually have to go in there and change the titles, because I'm trying to think outside. Like, if I'm an outsider, if I don't go to your church, if I don't know anything about Jesus, I look at this title, and one of them had like flea market as the title, and I'm like, what does that even mean? That doesn't even answer that doesn't even really talk about what we're talking about on this video. And so it's really important that your title is something that's going to catch their attention and really inform people what is being talked about.
Yeah, I think just making things as easy for people as possible is really the goal. Like, don't make them guess at what you're talking about. Don't be cute. Just, hey, this is what's going on. Whether it's with a sermon, that's with the sermon podcast in particular, but anything that you do, make it obvious. This is what we're doing.
Yep.
And this is why this would be valuable to you.
Yep.
So
we just talked about the sermon, that's an easy win for someone to, if you're not doing it right now, it's an easy win for you to start doing that. But then let's talk about some other opportunities. You're doing this one that you're doing for your community. What are some other ones that that you've seen that have been really effective for churches to be doing for podcasting?
So I'm really glad to see people branching out and doing podcasts in other scenarios and other topics, because for a long time the only podcasts were an interview podcast about somebody's new book. And that's it. That's all you ever do, is a podcast about somebody's new book.
Yeah.
And so like this podcast, which is let's be action items to be, tips for people. Jeff's podcast was geared towards like digital and online pastors. Before COVID hit, he basically cornered the market because he was the only guy speaking to there. And so people are in churches as well are starting to have a podcast on, it might be a season on spiritual disciplines or something that's going on in the church or something like that. And so those are a few ideas that I've seen. There's more ideas that I've come up with, more than I can do, that I'd love to see. But those are ones that I'm thankful people are being creative and thinking outside the box for their ministries.
Yeah, I think, when COVID hit for us, we really, again, and everything shut down, we really looked at it. It's like, okay, so what are the opportunities here for us? And so what we started doing initially was we're going to do some video devotionals. And so our senior pastor and some other people on staff started just doing some devotionals. And we ranged them from 10 minutes long to about 30 minutes long. Mine were more on the side of the 10-minute long ones, but we had other ones doing them really long. And again, those were good, and we still actually do them. But those were good when people were at home and they were stuck at home and they were watching videos and whatnot. What we started seeing as the economy was starting to open back up again last summer was that those viewers were going down. So we thought, okay, so what do we need to do? We still believe that doing devotionals and giving encouragement to people was really necessary. And so we took those videos and took the audio from it and started doing podcasts from it. And we've seen a huge spike in our podcast, because now our podcasts are more than just the sermon. They are daily encouragement that people can get. And we're trying to answer questions that people are asking. So I think that's a really important one that we've seen and we've utilized podcasting for.
Awesome. Yeah, I've had some discussions. I love the question one, because as a pastor, people ask questions, and like it could be a child saying, like a boy asked me, he said, if God can do anything, why doesn't he end sin? And I went, and so like on both the level of like talking to him, but going, if he has this question, somebody else does too.
Yes.
Let me just write that down. Like the other night after someone's death, somebody asked me a question about the relationship of like people between heaven and hell. And what does the Bible say about, not actually between heaven and hell, it's actually heaven and earth. And so he's like, what does the Bible say about this? And I went, you know what, if he has that question, somebody else probably has that question. Let me write that down. So I don't have a podcast around that, but I think it's a great fit for the staff to be like, let's just keep track of any questions that people ask us. And then let's have a discussion talking about them.
Yeah.
Because, if an atheist asks a question of somebody in our church and they're left going, how do I answer that? And they ask you, then more than likely somebody else in the church has an atheist friend who asks them a question.
Yeah. No, I agree. And you can really change it up a lot too, because again, as the seasons of the year change, you can ask, like I took a time where I answered questions about Easter or Christmas. And so I took those themes and I said, okay, what are the questions people are asking during Christmas time? And so you can really come up with a lot of questions and that you can answer. So, well, let me ask you this question. So someone might say, as they're listening to this talk, they're like, this is great. This sounds like a good idea, but I'm just Joe Schmo. I'm just someone random. No one's going to listen to me. Why should I start a podcast? What kind of encouragement would you give them about starting a podcast?
Well, first of all, if you have somebody that will pay attention to what you have to say,
Yeah.
whether you pastor a church of 30 people or you pastor a church of 3,000 people, somebody right now is listening to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than being like, man, how do I become a televangelist? Like, God wants to use me with certain people in my circle of influence. And so having a podcast about, I mean, for my wife and I, it's about our garden. I mean, it wasn't a huge podcast, but there would be between 30 and 50 people every week that would want to hear about our garden and what we're learning and what we failed at. And like, then they would like tell us about their gardens and what they're learning and what they're growing, and they'd be far beyond us.
Mm-hmm.
And so on some level, you're just saying, hey, you know what? I have something in my life that somebody might connect with and love and enjoy. And that digitally, people can connect with people who aren't just physically near them. It could be a friend from high school in a different state, or it could be somebody who just has your specific love of a certain thing, and you make a podcast for them. I mean, that was Jeff Reed's thing with the Church Digital, is he connected with people who had no resources for them.
Yep.
Digital pastors were blazing a trail, and they had nobody else that they knew that was like them. And so Jeff became kind of the centerpiece for people who were trying to figure out, what do we do?
Yep.
And so like digital allows you to reach people where they're at the time that they want to be reached and when they're interested. And so going, you know what, it's not the size of my audience that's important. It's the fact that I do have something to say. And I think documenting is way better than creating. Honestly, nobody wants to hear you create a podcast on the latest news of the day, but they might care about to hear you say something that you're passionate about and some hobby that you have, or something that you're doing in your church. They might actually want to hear that.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I was hoping you'd kind of answer it that way too, because I can just tell you about my dad, who lives in a small town in Pennsylvania, and he swears by his pastor. His pastor, and again, he goes to a church of under 100 people, but anytime his pastor sends an email out or does a Zoom call, my dad's the first in line to get that, and be sign up for that Zoom call, because he wants to hear from that pastor. So whether you have a small audience or a big audience, it does not matter. It's that people love to hear from you. And so they're going to listen to what you have to say. And it's just taking that extra step of saying, okay, I'm going to put this in a podcast format. Because again, I think podcasts, even though there's tons and tons of podcasts out there, they're still so popular. And again, people want to hear from people they know and people they trust. And that's you. As their pastor, as their minister, that's you.
Yeah, that I would say that's definitely it. Just because there are big famous podcasts and lots of people download the ones from Gimlet Media or from NPR or from Christianity Today or something like that, just because people somewhere do that, doesn't mean that the people in your circle of influence do. I mean, and that's part of my podcast with Jeremy. We're betting on the fact that only 7% of the people in our circle of influence are meaningfully like involved in a church and being discipled, which means 93% of the people in our circle of influence do not attend a church, have not heard the gospel. They are not being discipled. And so being like, well, everybody's made their own choices. There's big church podcasts already. Well, a lot of the people around here aren't going to go and listen to a famous preacher from another state. They're not going to go listen to a pastor who is incredibly gifted at a church of 1,000 people over in Indiana or down in Alabama. They don't care about that. But if their friend around here says, like, I'm going to introduce you to this church and this pastor and what they have to say that's kind of relevant to what you're wrestling with and what you're thinking through, then they don't care about the size of the audience. They're just like, hey, I might run into this guy at Walmart. I might see this guy at the library.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
yeah, dude, that's awesome. Well, this has been awesome. This has been very encouraging. Kind of as we wrap up though, what kind of final thoughts or comments would you share with us about podcasting and what churches and ministries can be doing with this?
Yeah, a large part of my thinking on podcasts comes from Gary Vaynerchuk. So I want to make it clear, I'm not the original one to say, hey, document, don't create. That was Gary Vee. That was him. But I think that the landscape for podcasts is wide open, that it really has not been tapped. It is kind of like, it is Yeah, I think that there's a huge future for podcasting, especially for smaller niche podcasts. We're starting to see the rise of Mars Hill is showing that you could have a non-traditional podcast geared towards pastors and church leaders that doesn't look like 5 tips and here's the latest book that you should read. Like there's a whole nother thing that could be going on with that. And so I actually think it just makes sense to get on the bandwagon of learning how to podcast before you have to,
Yep.
while it's still helpful, while it's still relevant. In my case, I hope that we can raise up leaders for our area, that we can reach outsiders who wouldn't walk in the doors of a church because they're afraid of pastors. They're afraid, is the church for me? And so I want to tear those walls down for our area. But there's a whole landscape of podcasts, leadership podcasts that just haven't been done.
Mm-hmm.
There are all sorts of stuff that I think there's a wide open opportunity for. And so just do an experiment and try something to start with so you actually understand the medium. Then when a good idea comes, you're like, okay, cool, I've been doing this for a while.
Yep. No, I agree completely. And just to go back to the Anchor thing, again, Anchor takes care of a lot of the distribution and whatnot for it. So you don't have to really worry about, oh, how do I get this on iTunes, or how do I get this on Google Play or Spotify? They take care of a lot of that stuff for you. It's really kind of simple that way. So I would, again, really encourage you to do it. Joe, give me your podcast, the one that you do with Jeremy. What's that podcast title name?
It's called TLDR Preaching Edition. Too Long Didn't Read Preaching Edition. I'd been sitting on that for a while. I was like, I don't listen to sermons. I just don't. Like there are preachers that I love. I just don't take the time to do that. And I'm like, I wonder if somebody would go, hey, I'd take a short little snippet. So we call it Too Long Didn't Read Preaching Edition.
Dude, that's awesome. I'm going to include that link in the show notes so people can check it out. And just as an example, again, of what they can be doing and how they can be doing it. How can people can connect with you? Are you still blogging?
Off and on. It's more like I have blogs in my head that I haven't done anything with. And the transition here was a little wild, lots of things going on. So I haven't really written a whole lot, but you can still go to josephfradosovich.com, and that's kind of the hub for anything that I end up doing, any writing that I do. So
that is awesome. I will send people there as well. Joe, you're an awesome resource. I love talking with you and having these conversations. So thanks for being on the podcast with me.
yeah, well, I love Sidekick. Well, it was YM Sidekick. Now it's just going to be Sidekick. I love the Church Digital because I've gotten a lot from it, and it's helped us make sure that people who wouldn't hear the gospel otherwise get a chance to hear the gospel. And that's what this is about.
Yeah, well, it is awesome. And I appreciate it. Again, it's been great hanging with you over the years. So this is awesome. So thanks, Joe. And until next time, have a great one, man.
All right. Thanks, Tom, for having me.
All right. It's always great to talk with Joe. I love having him on the podcast. And I love how he's using his podcast to minister to his local community. He's not thinking worldwide vision and how can I get my name out there? How can I get my brand out there? He's talking about how he can serve his local community. And I love what he's doing there. And I love the discussion we had about how churches can target their local community and serve that community through podcasting. So my question for you is, what stood out from you from that interview? What did Joe say, or what did I say that really challenged you? Or what questions do you have from it? If you've got questions, if you've got thoughts, I would love for us to carry this conversation on. You can either post it in the comment section or hit me up on Twitter at TA Pounder. That's my Twitter handle. I live there. I love to talk with people on there. So if you've got questions or thoughts about this podcast, go on Twitter and share that. I would love to have this conversation with you a little bit more. All right, heroes, well, that wraps it up for this episode of the Church Digital Sidekick Podcast. Thanks so much for being with me today. As always, if you love this content, you can go and subscribe to it from iTunes, Spotify, or you can go to thechurch.digital and subscribe to it as well. There we've got lots of other content and lots of other thoughts and ebooks on there about what you can be doing in this digital age to encourage and inspire people in your community. So go to thechurch.digital today. All right, heroes, well, I hope you have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week, and until next time, have a great one.